Good afternoon or morning, depending upon where you are. Welcome. Hello. Thank you for joining us. I am Debbie Vini. I am the Senior Vice President of Communications and Marketing at the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And I am delighted to have with me today Mr. Ian Rowe, Mr. Rob Reed, and Mr. Sharif El-Mekki. And we are going to have part 2 of a civil discussion on critical race theory. Now, for those of you who were able to join us in June, we had the first part of this discussion. It was during our national conference, the National Charter Schools Conference, and it was certainly one of the most watched and most talked about sessions of that conference. And it was so spicy that we didn't really even get to have any audience questions. And that was good and bad. Good because it was spicy and it was interesting. And the gentleman really, I think, both engaged in a very thoughtful discussion with each other. And this specifically, I'm speaking of Ian and Sharif. So it was good. They didn't agree, challenged each other, asked some tough questions of each other, but kept it civil as it should be. And that's one of, I think, the most important things we want to accomplish today. A lot of these discussions are happening, but they're happening in vacuums. And so we, retreat to our corners and share our opinions with people who are like-minded, but don't necessarily give ourselves an opportunity to hear from people who have different perspectives who might challenge our thinking. So that's what we're looking to do today. We've put some extra time on the agenda to allow for questions and answers, and it is certainly my intent that we will be able to get to those today. So thanks again for joining us. And I'm going to now ask my colleague, Rob Reed, who heads our legal team at the Alliance, to start by giving us an overview of what we see happening nationally with legislation related to critical race theory.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Debbie, and good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're doing well. As Debbie mentioned, my aim here is to largely focus on kind of the state legislative responses to this issue, but I thought it would also be helpful to just identify a few other responses as well. And Patty, if you could help with advancing the next slide, that would be great. There we go. All right, so here's the outline for this presentation. As I mentioned, I'll give an overview of the state legislative activity, briefly discuss some of the common language and common penalties we see for non-compliance, delve a little bit into other state level activity, and just briefly want to, again, highlight some of the federal legislative activity, some of the local school board activity, little bit of the courthouse activity. Just want to highlight a particular example of where we're seeing it there, and then end with some concluding thoughts. So there we go. So here's an overview of the state legislative activity. According to sources, currently legislators in 23 states have introduced bills that would either restrict the teaching of critical race theory or divisive concepts, and relatedly how teachers can discuss racism and sexism. Out of those 23 bills, 8 states have signed them into law. This actually further breaks down that legislative activity. So as I mentioned earlier, 8 states have signed these bills into law. If you all actually attended the conference webinar, at that time, the number stood at 5 states, so it has now increased to 8 states. And then outside of that, there are almost 20 other states that have either considered it or are currently considering this type of legislation. You'll see the bill has either been proposed or moving through the state legislature, has been pre-filed for the next legislative session, or was withdrawn, stalled indefinitely, and ended without further action. So I wanted to highlight the common language you see in many of these pieces of legislation. You might see that it prohibits critical race theory. You're probably more likely to see that it prohibits what's called divisive concepts. And actually, out of the 8 states that have enacted these laws, I think Idaho is the only one that actually explicitly mentions critical race theory in the law's language. Again, more likely you'll see divisive concepts or some variation of that term. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but just wanted to give you a sample of kind of the typical language you'll see across the board in many of these pieces of legislation. And it goes on again to the second page here as well. So that gives you a sense of really what these pieces of legislation are seeking to prohibit. Notably, the divisive concepts language that I just reviewed actually mirrors that found in President Trump's executive order 13950, combating race and sex stereotyping from last year. You all might recall that executive order was ultimately enjoined by a federal court last December. And of course, when the Biden administration came into office, they rescinded it. But I thought it was notable that most legislators have actually lifted the language from that particular executive order and inserted it or incorporated it into legislative vehicles. Outside of kind of critical race theory and divisive concepts, you'll also see kind of specific prohibitions against things like the 1619 Project as well. When you review these pieces of legislation, you typically see about three themes that emerge vis-a-vis penalties for non-compliance. You'll see withholding a percentage of school funding. You'll see that the prohibited classes cannot count towards the student's graduation, or you may see that there's some disciplinary action for a school district employee, including a teacher. And that typically might take the form of a possible revocation of the teacher's certificate or license. So in addition to state legislative activity, we also see examples of other state level activity. And that has typically come in the form of State Board of Education, either resolutions or rules. In Montana, there was a case where the Attorney General issued an opinion on the matter as well. So we see this on multiple levels within the state activity itself. And so just as there's legislative activity on the state level, we also see examples of it on the federal legislative level. And so I just wanted to highlight these. Many of them have been introduced. They have not really advanced that far, but I wanted to at least spotlight that this issue has kind of permeated kind of the Congress as well. My sense is from speaking with folks who are a bit closer to Congress and federal affairs is that many of these vehicles were just introduced more from a political messaging, posturing standpoint, and the likelihood that any of these would actually make it into actual policy is very unlikely. But again, just wanted to highlight that we see this across multiple fora. And outside of the federal legislative and the state legislative context, we've also started to see this in local school board activity. And I've just listed a few different counties where we've seen, again, on the local level, school board resolutions or policies or bans against either critical race theory or these divisive concepts. And finally, as this is the case with many issues that see kind of heightened activity, when we see it in the legislative context, we typically also see it in the courthouse. And so there are cases that have critical race theory or these divisive concepts at their core. The one I just wanted to briefly highlight for these purposes is a case in which a student and his mother filed a lawsuit against Democracy Prep, the Nevada campus. It's over a sociology of change course, and it really actually covers a variety and plethora of legal theories ranging from First Amendment to 14th Amendment to Title VI, Title IX, and even some state claims. And so the case is currently in a pretrial posture. And so they are currently litigating a motion to dismiss the case that Democracy Prep has filed. And so it'll be interesting to see how this case ultimately unfolds. I think it will provide some context within which we might be able to anticipate how cases going forward and other jurisdictions may treat this issue as well. So just wanted to highlight this particular case largely because it deals with a charter school network and specifically curriculum that is offered there. I will say as a footnote that Democracy Prep does not consider this curriculum critical race theory, but it has been characterized in the media as a critical race theory case. And so wanted to at least spotlight that for you. And so finally, my sense, again, just from what we've seen on the state legislative, the federal legislative, and the courthouse levels, is that these responses to critical race theory, divisive concepts, are likely to continue. On the state legislative side, I would imagine they will continue, particularly in red states. Again, as I mentioned, since June, we've already seen 3 more states enact these laws. And my sense is also that the lawsuits will probably continue, at least in the near future. I think as with other lawsuits, the degree to which some of these litigants gain traction or victories in these cases, you may see more being filed down the road. But I expect, at least in the near future, that we may see a bit more on both levels. And so I'm happy to stop there. I will turn it back over to Debbie, and thank you all so much.
There we are. Rob, that was an excellent legal analysis. Thank you so much for that detail. While you were talking, there were a couple of questions that came in on the chat, and I'm actually going to punt those over to you right quick before we get into talking to Ian and Sharif. We had specific questions about what's happening in Ohio and in DC. And while you're looking that up, there's also another question about any schools that had resolutions against teaching critical race theory, schools or networks that we know of that had resolutions against teaching critical race theory. I personally do not know of any, and I'm not sure if you do, but I wanted to put that out to you for a question.
Yeah, no, appreciate the question. I'm not aware, at least on the granular kind of school by school level, if there are any resolutions on that front. I think on your first question regarding Ohio, I think there is, and I think if we were to go back, I won't do this now, but go back to one of my first few slides, you'll see that Ohio was listed under the bill proposed or moving through state legislature currently. And my understanding is that it would ban school districts and state agencies from teaching what I referred to earlier as divisive concepts. Interestingly enough, that's one of those pieces of legislation that also incorporates one of the penalties I mentioned. So it would withhold state funding to districts that disobeyed that prohibition. DC, I actually haven't heard as much about more recently. The one thing I will say is that on the federal legislative side, there is a pending piece of legislation that has been introduced. Again, I don't think it is advanced at all, but it seeks to prohibit critical race theory in DC public schools.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, so again, I don't think any of that's really going to advance into actual policy. Again, I think it's more political posturing messaging leading up to midterm elections, but that's about what I know with regard to anything vis-a-vis DC.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rob.
Of course.
All right. Ian and Sharif, it is wonderful to have you back. I hope you gentlemen have enjoyed the rest of your summer. We're now into fall, and I wanted to start by asking each of you to just kind of reground us and tell me, how do each of you define critical race theory? And tell me whether you think this is something that should be taught based on your definition in K-12 education.
Sharif, do you want to start?
Sure. Good to be here. Good to see you again. And thanks, Rob, for that additional framing, about like what's happening at the policy and legal level. And I think it's appropriate because, for me, the definition of critical race theory is it's a lens to analyze how laws have been applied, crafted and applied in this country based on race. and how that permeates various institutions. And so being able to use a legal framework to understand how things were envisioned originally and how they continue to perpetuate. And so the idea of like whether critical race theory in itself should be taught in K-12, you know, I think everything is about where the human growth and development of your students. You know, so if you have a core, yes, and one, this is a legal term that was, you know, crafted by folks like Kimberly Crenshaw and, you know, and others who were thinking about, you know, how to help explain and how to analyze why things existed and why they, you know, continue. So when Derek Bell, you know, uses this language, he's looking at some very particular things. So for a student, if there's a senior and they have an AP course or things like that, and they're going deep in particular things, and if they're using that term, okay, I understand why. If you're in elementary school, then you're likely, and you start analyzing the Constitution or this law or that law, then that's a very different thing. And I think, unfortunately, people are using, you know, CRT as a term, like the ocean, and saying, oh, it's everything that's in it,
right.
And that's CRT. And I think that's not only patently false, but I think it is a devised and designed technique to create what I call hysteria, but it's really just ridiculousness in that space. I think in K-12, we should be mainly focused on how do we help develop critical thinkers, and whatever that takes to be able to analyze, assess, and critique. That's what being a full citizen means.
Yep. Thanks for that, Sharif, and great to be back with you, Debbie, Rob, and hello, everyone. Yeah, you know, in this discussion, it all comes down to how do you define critical race theory in the first place? Because depending on how you define it will likely determine whether you're for or against it, or you know, what practices you're talking about. And I think it is important to distinguish between what is a theory and what are the practices that I think we'll talk about more in the midst of this conversation. For me, the definition is not something I define. I just go back to the original architects. I mean, as Sharif said, you know, Kimberly Crenshaw, Derek Bell, you know, I use Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk, and, you know, there's a book on the internet, you know, Critical Race Theory, an Introduction, and they say very explicitly, critical race theory, quote, questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and neutral principles of constitutional law, end quote. The reason I, you know, use that definition, for me, it's first of all, it's clear and you don't have to debate it. Like, this is literally what the architects describe. And so when I see something that challenges equality theory, so that for me, that means equal protection under the law, equal opportunity, equal rights. If I see a theory that challenges that, then I'm fundamentally skeptical of what that definition purports. But whether or not it should be taught, for me, you can't ban a theory. You know, in the same way you can't ban, you know, talking about communism versus capitalism. In a healthy society, we have to be able to, like we're going to do in this conversation, take concepts that might question the very foundation of the society that you live in, but have the confidence that through democratic discourse, you can come to some reasoned conclusions. So for me, I actually, you know, if it's a seminar in high school or if it's in higher ed, to me, let's debate critical race theory versus equality theory. And I have a level of confidence that equality theory will likely win out, but that not for people to voice what they believe is right about critical race theory.
Debbie, I just wanted to say one thing about, you know, particularly the equality theory. I think, you know, there is in America a theory of equality. What the CRT does, and I think it should actually, in some instances, many instances, should be called, let's change it to critical race facts. It's challenging the idea if equality is actually ascribed in law. If that, you know, that symbol of justice, if that that woman, that statue that you see holding the scale, Is she actually blindfolded, or is she peeking when there's a Black or brown person that this law is attributed to? So I would say what it's doing is it's challenging the idea of equality theory, not challenging whether human beings should be equal. It's challenging, do the laws, do the policies, are they truly colorblind? Are they truly applied equally or not? And I think that's it. It's not to say, oh, whether people should be equal or things like that. It's what's the reality that
Right.
Black and brown people are facing and have faced in this country when, since it was, taken.
Right. And I basically agree that every law should be assessed, because again, this thing says it challenges this idea of neutral principles of constitutional law. We should be neutral on race, gender, class, everything. So again, if it's questioning the very neutrality of laws, just like you're talking about, then I want to dive into that. What does that actually mean? One of the things that was interesting about Rob's the delineation of divisive concepts, I hadn't seen some of that language, but I guess the first one said it prohibits any teaching that would place one race or sex is inherently superior over any other. Well, I agree with that. I don't know if we need a ban, but we should have neutral. There shouldn't be anything where we're trying to put one race or sex above each other. One thing I did find interesting, Rob, one of the bullet points was about feeling discomfort. Like I don't know how you ban that. So you got to look into the language of what exactly are these folks really trying to do.
Okay, I want to dig in on something a little bit. So Sharif, I'm gonna throw this one at you. When people are objecting to critical race theory, what do you believe it is that they are actually reacting to? What is it that they specifically take offense to?
Well, I think some of it is just responding to, what other things get people hype and upset, right? I think so many folks, when they're saying like, oh, we're angry about this, we're against it, and they have no idea what it is and what they're talking about. So it's hard to actually, make assumptions besides the fact that there's a certain group of people who've been consistently organized around certain themes, around certain tropes, around certain ideas that benefit some and don't others. When we're talking about this idea of neutrality, applied neutrality, my question is always like, where does that neutrality start? After you've buried people 13 feet under and you're 13 feet above, and then you're 13 floors above, and you say, hey, let's apply everything neutrally now. And what they're saying is like, ignore everything that's happened, ignore the entire trajectory, ignore how things have been constructed, and just apply everything. We've all probably seen that cartoon that I used in school, and in some of these states it would be banned, but it was basically a cartoon that's showing people rounding a track in a race, and how the white runners were able to lap. If you're familiar with track, if you go all the way around someone on a track, you've lapped them. They were showing lapping and these before they even got out of the blocks. And if we say, oh, at this point, let's just apply it neutral, like everything's neutrality and ignoring things that haven't been, then that's problematic. And I think other times people want to frequently, and you see this a lot, people want to try to control things, particularly, what does education, school, et cetera, look like? And so anytime people, even if it's not really, but if there's a perception of loss of control and power, then there's going to be backlash. And we've seen this consistently, where folks have pushed back against the status quo, even if it benefits, other folks. We saw this in the history of creating public schools in the South. There were white families who were poor, who felt like we don't need that, and we want to push back against this idea of public school, right? And then you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't benefit you. And then when they see little Black children walking around with books, then they said, hey, wait a minute, we want a piece of that. Why are they getting that, right? And so there's always some pushback if there's a status quo that they believe is being affronted. And honestly, there's a lot of status quo principles that need to feel affronted. They need to be addressed. And that, I think, is really, because many of them don't even know what CRT was. And we say capital CRT and lowercase CRT, like last time. Capital CRT is critical race theory. Lowercase CRT is culturally responsive teaching. They were against that too, right? So sometimes it's just anything that folks are not privy to, they were unaware of, they're ignorant of, it creates fear and anger. And you know what Yoda says, that leads to the dark side.
Right.
Okay, Ian, I'm going to get right at it. So this is about race and the really complex history of race in America and how that is taught in schools. So I'm going to ask you a very pointed question. Do you believe that there is a role for discussing race in K-12 education? And if so, what do you think there should be?
Oh, well, of course. I mean, race is a factor of the human dimension. I mean, it's even crazy that we have to ask that question. So so obviously the answer is yes. The question is how. And I think the thing that probably makes this conversation so controversial right now is if when you talk about race, are you reduced to just your race in terms of your sense of possibility, what you can learn, the context in which you're in? Sharif, you just answered, why are people against critical race theory? I think the answer varies for a lot of different folk. But I think part of the issue that seems that has really gotten people to be upset is, am I reduced to nothing else but my external characteristics, like my race? So like Rob described that case in Oregon. I think the situation in that, I'm sorry, not in Oregon, in Nevada, with Democracy Prep, where a student, I think it's a Black mom of a mixed race child who looks white, but in this class, he was asked, I think, to stand up and, so confess his white privilege, which was ironic because his mother is Black. And I think part of their issue is that, he has a lot of characteristics about him. And in his particular case, privilege was not necessarily the thing that he would describe his situation to be. And so I think there's obviously, we have to talk about race, but we have to do it in such a way that we don't want to convince our kids that the most salient characteristic about themselves is solely their race. We have to be able to talk about our history. We have to acknowledge what has transpired in this country, as well as the level of discrimination that still exists today. But that shouldn't put a kid in a position that if I'm white, you're an oppressor, period, full stop. If I'm Black, you're oppressed, period, full stop. And sometimes the dialogue, at least certainly some of the practices I've seen in certain contexts related to critical race theory, that is actually happening. And so I know for some people that certainly is a non-starter for them.
Guys, we've got some great questions coming in from our participants, and I'm gonna pop into some of those. So I'm gonna take them in order. So the first one we've got here is a question here about whether the proponents of critical race theory, do you believe, and of course you're not mind readers, do you believe that they are actually supporting the teaching of divisive concepts? Or do you think that the lawsuits that have sprung up are a misrepresentation of critical race theory?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I'll cite an existing lawsuit. This is in Evanston, Illinois, where this was back in 2019, I think a teacher, or maybe even earlier, maybe 2018, she brought a lawsuit because the Evanston School District had basically separated the teachers by race, called colorism, privilege walk, where they had, if you were, and so they lined up all the kids in a horizontal line, and they said to the white kids, if you're white, take 2 steps forward. If you're Black, take 2 steps backward, right? I mean, that's just like, to me, that that is, in my view, destructive to kids of all races. But literally in the lesson plan, it said they wanted to ensure that white kids understood, quote, their internalized dominance, end quote. Like, what are we trying to like create? Little white supremacists, right? So I don't know if that's a mischaracterization of critical race theory, but that practice I think is destructive. And again, you know, you can't read the minds of people who are reporting this stuff, but to me, that kind of practice, whatever assets there are related to critical race theory, it's that kind of stuff that makes people wonder, what is the objective? What are you trying to accomplish? And by the way, the reading scores in Evanston continue to decline. And for me, a lot of this discussion is just a big distraction from the fundamental thing where a lot of Black and white kids are not reading at grade level.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, when people try to ascribe an entire legal theory to some missteps, some poor planning, some misunderstanding of human growth and development and what a pedagogical framework and academic standards look like in a particular school, classroom, what that looks like. You know, it always to me, it highlights or illuminates that there's always this ulterior motive. Like, yes, they're latching on to that. I wonder, like, how often have they filed lawsuits on behalf of Black and brown children when there was some kind of academic malpractice happening? How often Black and brown children were subjected to absolutely ridiculous lessons, courses even. And these folks are silent. And so we have to look at, like, what's the common denominator that forces people to now, you know, jump on their horse and gallop from town to town and start yelling about things. It's whiteness, it's white children. It's like, oh, they're feeling uncomfortable in a particular situation. I wouldn't do a privileged walk with children. And I would also, you know, as a former history teacher, social studies teacher, and literature teacher, we absolutely analyze how were laws applied to Black people and white people and Native American people. That's a very different, it's the idea of, is this really neutral or is it not, right? But that's very different than trying to make a child in that moment feel inherently badly about themselves and their essence. We actually want them to be the best that they can be. Right? But being the best that you can be and looking at, hey, here's the history of this country, and having them decide, do I benefit from the way that things are skewed or do I not? And having them dive into those conversations, that's about being a full citizen at some point, being a critical thinker at some point, and being someone, if we're all talking about what education is supposed to be, it's supposed to help you improve society. Oh, there's only a few group of people who feel like for everybody, society was better in the past. And there ain't that many Black and brown people who feel that way.
Well said. Rob, I've got a question for you, actually. This is about the lawsuits that you gave an overview on at the beginning. So we have one of our participants asking if you can be a little bit more specific about the lawsuit. She's not clear about who's being sued versus who's the plaintiff and what exactly they are looking to get out of the suits.
Yeah, no, great question. And Ian actually did a great job with the Evanston, Illinois case. Again, the democracy prep case, as he also mentioned, again, is a mixed race boy, Black mother, who's filing the lawsuit against Democracy Prep. So they are the plaintiffs, Democracy Prep serving as a defendant in this case. And again, it relates to an exercise where, again, he had to effectively mention something about his identity, gender identity, racial identity, and was reluctant to do so. And so he has filed a variety of claims, again, ranging from constitutional claims like First Amendment compelled speech, like they wanted to compel him to participate in something that he did not want to, equal protection because this exercise, you know, invokes separation based on race, you know, sex, yada, yada, yada. Their Title VI that deals with federal funds that go to institutions. And so that is also incorporated into it, as well as Title IX on the sex discrimination front. And so we've seen cases like that, like the Evanston one. You may also see lawsuits where teachers white teachers may be filing lawsuits against either the school district or school about certain training exercises they have to undergo, where they have to effectively acknowledge that whites are inherently oppressors or racist or whatever the case may be. And so they may file a suit against the school district. You know, I will say that at least right now, there probably is a concerted effort with regard to pushing these types of lawsuits. And some of these organizations that are pushing them on behalf of these plaintiffs are pretty well funded, like the Democracy Prep lawsuit in Nevada is being pushed by Liberty Justice Center, I believe is the name of the organization. And I think they're pretty well funded through donations and the like. And so that gives you a general sense. If you want to shoot me an email, we can talk a little bit more about them, but that's kind of typically what you see vis-a-vis the lawsuits generally, if that helps.
Thanks so much, Rob. I'm going to go to another.
I was just about to say, I do wish, those proponents of critical race theory would acknowledge these instances where it does seem like things go too far. Like, I would imagine we would all agree when things start to violate the Civil Rights Act or First Amendment rights, we can come together on that. And maybe if we could find more common ground, especially when at the extremes we're going too far, that might actually create a lane where we could have more discussion about what is it that we're really trying to get at.
No, I would just add, a layer to that. And again, everybody wants to come to common ground now. And I'm not against common ground, but there's been no common ground in the public school system when we're talking about Black and brown children. A Black child can go to a school named after Robert E. Lee. They can pass a statue of Robert E. Lee. They can go and have a curriculum that teaches all kind of nonsense. And there's not a single thought of what is that child being subjected to? What is the unsafe environment for their cultural, intellectual, and emotional aspects? There's no thinking of that. Now, all of a sudden, because there are a few places where they may go a little bit too far and they need help with pedagogy and professional development, but it's lawsuits. And the other time it's like, oh, well, let's just talk to hey, teachers, stop showing up in blackface. Like, stop doing that. So let's analyze this curriculum that you're doing. Let's look at the themes and patterns in your school and district. Forget the country, in your school and district. Who are the marginalized and how have they been treated? What does the curriculum say about their history, their contributions, their humanity? Let's start there. But no, it's like we're going to ignore all of that in the past as well as contemporarily. And we're going to look at, oh, they made the kids do privilege walk. Oh, fire up the lawsuits. Like, and so my thing is like, there's such a lack of understanding of the death when you're talking about like in school and how one-sided curricula is against one group, centering one group and marginalizing another group. And that is still not talked about nearly enough. It's not addressed nearly enough. We still have curriculum and textbooks full of garbage. We have now people who are talking about CRT and they want to ban Dr. King's letter from Birmingham. They want to not talk about Ruby Bridges. Now you're talking about people who are already ignorant of history. I mean, America is well known around the world to be ignorant of its own history, let alone international. And now we're talking about, hey, and you know what? Some of this stuff actually makes us, have to question American exceptionalism. So we need to just remove it. If our youth and students and teachers weren't prepared before, where will they be with this continuation of this type of stuff is my question. And so we have to be, and it shows a lack of critical analysis and such short-sightedness and just absolute reactionary rage to the loss of control, power, and some things that people aren't even aware of. They don't even know why they're angry, but they're like, oh, we're in a frenzy. All right, I'm signing up. Any opportunity to be in a frenzy against anything that looks different than what I was taught in school.
Yeah, I mean, if you're saying, look, we're obviously in agreement. If there's a school that's saying we don't want to teach Letter from a Birmingham Jail or Ruby Bridges, that is
a school. We're talking about a whole state that's trying to introduce some of this.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, obviously that's ridiculous, right? That's ridiculous.
Listen, I mean, where was Christopher Rufo, one of those people who said, oh, we want to just make the word or the term CRT toxic, right? And that's what they're doing. Like, for him to come out, you know, and they're blatant about it. Like, oh, we want to make this toxic to touch, and we're going to unleash it across the country. So when a Christopher Rufo and all those organizations and people who are behind the dumb stuff, and that gets inserted into you know, schools and districts and how they want to position themselves as so-called educators, it's severely problematic.
Yeah, and again, I mean, I agree with you. Like, that kind of stuff, it doesn't make sense. And for me, it gets back to the whole idea of parental choice in education. Like, the reason I know you launch schools, the reason I run schools, is because I want to provide the empowering alternative to our kids. So if that's the situation, I mean, in the district that I'm in here in the South Bronx, you know, only 2% of kids that started 9th grade in 2015, 4 years later, graduated from high school ready for college, right? So that means they all started, you know, either they dropped out or they actually graduated and still couldn't do reading or math without remediation if they went to college. But in New York City right now, today, there is a cap. If you wanted to start a charter school to have an alternative, you couldn't have that. So we got to fight this on multiple levels, because I'm down with you on that. If that's the curriculum that's all that's available, and we have a parent that wants the best for her kid, and that's all she has, that is a crime. That's the structural kind of barrier. I'm all with you, 100%. We got to take those down.
Thank you, Ian. I'm going to take another question from our attendees. Now, I want to note I'm doing these in order because they're juicy questions, and so I'm going to get to as many of them as I can. But please, everyone who's taking the time to submit questions, know that I'm not cherry picking. I'm just taking them in the order that they came. Okay, so our next question is, what can parents do to request that this be added to their school's curriculum? I think people are getting hung up on the term CRT instead of the lessons needing to be taught. So that's the question that's presented. What can parents do to request that this be added to their school's curriculum?
I mean, and like CRT, like truth. How do you make sure that truth, historical truth, and it's not just the historical truth in like, oh, this happened or that happened. I think it's really important for families to be able to look at it and like, okay, is my child, as they're going through a science lesson from pre-K to 12th grade, do they understand that there were more than white men who contributed to science or math or literature or so all of that. So this truth and this understanding, I think is absolutely important. And I think for families, one of the best ways to do it is make sure that you're even more aware of it as even someone outside, because then you know exactly what you're advocating for. You know what you're elevating at that dining room table and that car ride home. If their child is saying like, hey, we read about this, you're like, hey, who, you know, what have other groups, who was centered, right? Even if we start having, one of the things I try to do as a teacher, and I think I mentioned this the last time we were together, as an 8th grade teacher, I wanted my students to think about whose voices, perspective, and experiences were centered and whose was missing. And so even if we just start with that and having those conversations and be able to share or point out our child, our biological child in the right direction, then they can advocate and ask questions about whatever is being taught, as well as we can advocate for it. But I would say absolutely, if you see over and over again, like, whoa, this is kind of one-sided. This is slanted. This is, are y'all never going to talk about other people's experiences under the same law or this amendment or whatever? That's, I think, where some of these conversations have to begin. But the more we are just aware, we don't have to be a historian, but just if we're asking who does this center, whose voice is centered and whose is marginalized, whose voice is missing. Even if we start with that type of question, it will be helpful to advance the dialogue and be more of a critical thinker than just taking whatever it is that folks are sharing with our students.
And let me just add that I think coming out of last year and COVID, all the shutdowns and all that, I think there's a strong interest, particularly in the Black community, of just better options around curriculum. So the Census Bureau just released some data, something like, it was only like about 3.3% of Black families were homeschooling. Their most recent census report, so that number is now 16.6%. That is a huge increase. And I think, to me, what it suggests is that, particularly in the Black community, we are aching for more, especially historical information that tells a more complete story of the African-American experience in the United States. We may have talked about Reconstruction, which is Kaya Henderson's new initiative. I think that's a great new resource. And I joined forces with my colleagues at 1776 Unites, Bob Woodson, a whole bunch of amazing Black leaders, to say, it's not enough just to shout in the rain. Let's actually create a whole new curriculum. We're just in the early stages. And this curriculum, it includes things like the Rosenwald schools, which a lot of people don't know about, which is amazing to me. But it tells, in our view, a much more complete, unvarnished history of the United States. And it's been downloaded now more than 20,000 times in all 50 states. Teachers in charter schools, district schools, private schools, home schools, after schools, prison ministries, like wherever character formation is happening for kids. And so we teach about not only the Tulsa Massacre, but also the lead up to the Tulsa Massacre. Like, what was the level of entrepreneurship? How did Black people build wealth that was then taken away in the massacre? And then what happened in the aftermath, in the rebuilding? Like, tell the whole story. So anyway, I just think there's going to be more opportunities for more authentic curricula that tells a more expansive story, particularly of the history of Black people in our country, but not so narrow that you either paint only one picture of completely oppressed, or cherry pick the other way where you sanitize it. We just got to tell the whole story, warts and all.
Yeah. Let's not even call it sanitizing, right? Because it's actually, the exact opposite. And I would say, and I agree with you, what it was the build up to having Tulsa be such a economic powerhouse and in Oklahoma, and as well as the country, and where else were things like that happening. But what they would want you to do, Ian, is talk about that, skip over the massacre, and then just go over, and this is what they did to build up, right? There's always, they'll love to tell stories about, look at the resiliency. They forget, like, this is everything that we used our laws and policies to crush them. But wow, look at how they rise. You know what I mean? So that story continue. And I would say, we're talking about expanding. Let's expand even beyond that. Let's talk about they came before Columbus. Let's talk about what were African people doing? What was Abu Bakr II doing from Mali all the way to the Americas before that? What were those interactions a long time ago, right? What were those societies like here that they encountered, right? How did they look at themselves? How did they look at the world, right? Like, and so instead of just talking about, here's a very tightly wound Eurocentric view. It's like when we would talk about world wars, as an 8th grade teacher of social studies, we wouldn't just talk about, this is all about Europe, and then later on Japan, and then and America. We're like, what was happening in Africa during this time? What was happening in between Japan and China? Like, we're just moving beyond such a Eurocentric, one lens, flat way of looking at every aspect. We're looking at a world war, and all we talk about is Europe. That means it ain't that much of a world just in there, right? And so we have to just be, as educators, understand, like, what actually happened. What did Columbus write in his diary that has evidence to show that, there were actually Africans here that predated that, right? And so that's to me about expansion, not just, hey, here's your, this blip in historical references in this country from whatever marker that you want to put there, right? So let's expand beyond that.
I'm with you.
Thank you so much. Gentlemen, this one is a lengthy question, and I'm not going to try to summarize it. I'm going to let you hear the whole thing, okay? So critical race theory seems to focus on tearing down America and its principles of birthright in the Declaration of Independence that was a foundation for the civil rights movement led by Dr. King, Frederick Douglass, and many others. They used this birthright document as foundational for change. The ideas and principles espoused there seem to be the highest and most noble, such as all men are created equal and being endowed by their creator with unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I am wondering what principles of critical race theory are higher than those. Shouldn't we be focusing on principles superior to race and are inherent to being a man or woman? What would you say about this statement by Dr. Viktor Frankl? There are two races of men in this world, but only these two: the race of the decent man and the race of the indecent man. America seems to have the constitutional means to self-correct inequity. Okay, it was a mouthful, but I didn't want to summarize it. So that's the question that's laid out. Now, since you've heard the whole thing, I'll summarize a little bit. So the question is basically, should we not focus on all men being created equal as the foundation of what our nation is? And is there danger in some of the principles of critical race theory, which might suggest something otherwise?
I mean, go ahead, Ian.
No, I'm happy to take that. I mean, because I read the Delgado definition, critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory and neutral principles. I subscribe to, I think, what the questioner is asking, that the fundamental principles, like if you believe that when the Constitution was written, even though it said all men were created equal, it obviously didn't apply to everybody. Right? It didn't apply to color or gender, right? So that's why there had to be amendments, right? And so the question is, do we believe the principles that the country was founded on have embedded within them the tools of self-betterment and self-improvement? Because honestly, that is what even in the schools I lead, that's what I want young people to believe, that you have within you the tools of self-betterment and self-renewal. In some ways, it's like Hamilton said about a country, that it's without that foundation, it's actually unclear how it is that we would continue to move towards this idea of the more perfect union. And so, I hear the question, because I'm actually, Sharif, I'm really curious, what principles would you put above equality of opportunity, even though in reality we haven't met it yet? But what other principles should we be moving towards, especially as it relates to individuals as opposed to groups?
I mean, to be honest, and no disrespect, but I think it's laughable to even talk about, founding fathers and original documents of this country without talking about race. It's such an area of privilege to say, ignore all of that. Let's talk about humanity. Like, I don't understand that. Like, let's talk about humanity. I 100% agree. And let's talk about the themes and the patterns that we see consistently from the beginning to now. Where are they? How does that continue? And why is it protected? So when we're looking at that, let's look at, like, what does it actually say about African people? What does it say about indigenous people? What was done in the name of, how do you even talk about the history and ideals without looking at things like manifest destiny and what that meant? And how do those kind of concepts and constricted mindsets and deficit thinking about other human beings, how does that parlay? When you have legislators in Louisiana back in the day who said the best time to hate a Black person is before they're born, and you realize this is a person that's creating laws, but we're like, let's not pay attention to any of that. Let's just look at humanity, and that in itself will be the topic of the conversation. Let's do it. And then let's look at, is it neutral humanity? Or is certain people's humanity have to constantly be defended and protected, and others, it's almost back to that birthright. It is their birthright to be recognized as a full human being. There's a consistent thread and trend that I've seen that my 8th graders could easily see without me being dogmatic at all. Just like, hey, you know what? Let's analyze. Here's a document, and here are primary sources that said this is what they actually believe about the two races of men. One of them doesn't even get to the starting point with how this country was actually, the hostile takeover. So I think it's a little disingenuous to even think about as if everybody's on an equal plane, when clearly the data over and over again, no matter which angle you look at it, shows that it's not true.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to, yeah, I think we agree. Again, we don't have equality of opportunity right now. That's why we run schools and exercise choice. So again, I'm still wondering, what's the principle that would drive how we get to true equality of opportunity?
I mean, I think that's what everybody is that at least in my circle is very clear. Like there's something that's called being just. There is a vision, and when people talk about like reimagining, it's because this original how these chairs were set up on the deck, it was not thinking from a just lens. It was thinking from a very hierarchical racial caste system. And at no point in the history has that been totally dissolved. We may eat around the edges here and there. We may like play with this and terminology here and there, but at no point was it actually reimagined to say, this is what it looks like, right? And this is why you can have, people looking at, oh, it was, enslavement. It was North versus South, but now looking at Oregon that was created, oh, we're a free state, but no Black people can live here. Right? Like you have to be able to analyze all of it. Yes, there's a belief in humanity and what justice looked like, but we also have to recognize the reality of that that's not where this country is. That's not how it was originally conceived and thought of. That's not how the laws have been applied. That's not how the laws are applied now, right? So none of that. Someone asked years ago, I forget who it was like, if you think everything is fair, who do you want to go in front of that racist judge as a white person or a Black person? If it's fair, if it's just about the humanity, then it shouldn't matter. But we know it does matter.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that. I've got another question. This is a two-parter. So it starts by saying it seems like both of you think there's a difference between teaching critical race theory for elementary students versus higher education. With that in mind, do you think elementary students should know about critical race theory or be taught in a way early on where they know that these things exist? First part. Second question, which probably will go to you, Rob. With the critical race theory laws, do you think history, or any of us could answer this, do you think history will start to get buried? That students will start to leave school without knowing that these issues exist, if in fact some of the laws being proposed take effect?
I'll just say the sad part is in America, you actually don't need laws to bury history. That's a tried and true across many educational, throughout the educational ecosystem. You did not need laws, and there were laws in the past. There's laws being passed now, but by and large, there's a gross misunderstanding of American history, let alone international history. The contribution. This is why you're gonna have people railing against Michelle Obama when she suggests, like, hey, you know what, Black people, were forced to construct DC, and people are like, oh my gosh, what are you talking about? This is like the white people's, positionality. This is what we did. Like, no, like, listen, like, have a better understanding of like what actually happened. So you don't need laws to miseducate. That's already happening. They're using laws to, create fear, to have people second guess, to have people make sure that they double down on erasure. And so, yes, there will be more students in many places who will be less aware of what's happening. But the other part of that is there are going to be more students who are actually interested, more families who are more curious, because what is that? Why are they saying that? And you know what? Maybe that is a difference. When we started talking about teacher diversity, there were many folks like, you know what? I never even thought about that. I actually never had, someone diverse leading my classroom or my school. And so it was the conversation that got them to be more reflective. And I think that's what we'll see in many spaces, that teachers are going to and educators are going to go further and go beyond what is normally laid out on the table as far as here's the curriculum or here's the pedagogical framework, right? They're going to go beyond of thinking of, oh, what do white and European educational and behavior theorists say about teaching Black and brown children? They're going to start looking at people who are actually immersed and deeply in love with Black and brown communities and how they thought about educating their children. And so, and to the first part, again, CRT is a legal term. And no, I have a kindergartner, like them understanding what CRT is, they can understand, she can understand what fairness looks like from a 5-year-old perspective. She can understand when someone is not treated well, and you can build on that, right? You can look at things. And even at her young age, we talk about certain things of, here's what it looks like. And here, like, how can you even talk about history at anything? So whatever the level is, and I'm not an expert on kindergarten, first, second, and grade, at all, like as far as what the standards are, things like that. But I know with certainty, because as a former first and second grade student, I know what our teachers exposed us to, how they got us to think critically and how they got us to analyze that, oh, you know what, there are ways that we can improve both individually and societal, and how we could be a part of that. And this concept of lift as we climb to challenge what's going on and reimagine what it could look like for all, students and people.
I mean, if you're talking about elementary school, for me, because, again, I ran a network of elementary and middle schools for a decade. For me, this is where it becomes a huge distraction. I mean, the backdrop of all of this, right, is that still a little over a third of all kids in our country are reading at grade level, right? The majority of white kids can't read at grade level. A higher majority of Black kids can't read. And so why is that happening, particularly in elementary school, where that's where the foundation needs to be built? And you look at what happened after No Child Left Behind. You talk about social studies and history. It used to be that you had social studies 5 days a week. Now, in many districts, you might have social studies twice a week, maybe, or you might have social studies and science, but
alternating,
right? So the absence of knowledge, of content in elementary school curriculum, to me, is one of the most fundamental problems affecting all of our kids, right? And sometimes when we get so focused on critical race theory as like, we've had 2 sessions. I mean, I would love to have 2 sessions with you, Debbie, on reading in elementary school, because that is a much more significant problem facing all of our kids. So, and we need to be going in the opposite direction in terms of knowledge. We need more history, more social studies, more science in elementary school, because that's the stuff that will get kids engaged, and you have more opportunity for kids to see themselves in their history, in their communities.
See, that's the issue. And when I talk about my elementary school experience, that's exactly it. But you know what? We did see more of ourselves. That's not what most of them are going to see. That's not what most of them are going to see. There's so many who are going to go through this project. Right now, we're thinking about how do we help our high school and college teacher apprentices who are 99% Black. How do we help them configure, like, okay, phonics and the books that teach phonics? Black and brown children are rarely going to see themselves centered in it, right? And so how do we create those type of things? But if there are folks who are like, no, don't worry about it, everything is fine, then that's a different thing. So yes, and I think we have to stop creating it like it's a, teach about reading, don't teach about, other things. You can learn reading by reading other materials besides the very white-centric material that's pumped into all the schools and classrooms. Right? If your child is Black and brown, identify, and even if they're white, but if they're majority seeing, their own selves in this constant mirror, and others are seeing windows, right? Like, that's a way to challenge. Like, no, teach them how to read, and those phonics and phonemic awareness and all the steps that need to happen. How can you do that and also recognize their humanity, their dignity, and the impact of positive racial identity? And what does it mean to see 13 years of you're nowhere in existence, you're people, your civilization has not contributed anything, what does it mean to learn how to read in that context? Right? As opposed to when I went to elementary school, we all came out highly literate. We all were able to skip multiple grades, right? They set me up to be able to graduate high school as a 16-year-old, and I wasn't alone. Like it was the entire, like the school was set up.
I graduated 16. Yep.
Yeah, I'm just saying. I'm not saying it to brag, but I'm just saying like what the teachers were doing. And guess what? They were also thinking about the positive racial identity development and what society says to and about Black and brown children. How much is that internalized? And then we say, why aren't you buying into this school system? Some of it is just their psyche trying to protect themselves and like, yo, I'm opting out because this is such an oppressive. Not only am I being suspended and expelled, but I'm also being told directly and indirectly that you're worthless and you're worth less. And so is everyone that looks like you. And we can convey that in material. We can convey that in books and what's on our walls and who's leading our classrooms, schools, and boards, right? And so we have to, I think we can escape how all of this is tied in. They're not separate things. They're all tied in. And yes, we need better teacher prep programs and understanding of what it takes to get students to read. And particularly, what does it get to take students, to read who are from Black and brown communities? Like, what does that mean in many different instances, right? What did Cuba do to become a literate country? Right? Let's look at that. But no, why, the imperialistic mindset says, no, don't look at anyone else about how they learned anything, right? And so because everything is supposedly perfect, and it's only perfect for a very select few, which goes back to the founding of this country in those original documents. It was created for a very select few. So how do we expand this on multiple lenses, from multiple frameworks, so that it is inclusive and equitable? And then we can start talking about the theory of equality.
Yeah, I mean, I again, on this issue of racial identity, again, 100%, that's why we've created this curriculum. And I would definitely encourage folks to take a look at it, consider incorporating into your own work, 1776unites.com. Again, we've like 20,000 teachers, 20,000 downloads across the country. And for those that are interested, one thing that's interesting is not only about, do our kids know our history, do they also know contemporary thinkers? I did a debate a couple months ago on C-SPAN about critical race theory, talking to a Bryn Mawr professor, and a caller asked her if she'd heard of, she'd ever read the work of Thomas Sowell. And she said, I don't even know who that is. I was like, how can you not know one of the leading Black economists, or Walter Williams? So tonight, we're actually launching a new component of the 1776 Unites curriculum, which it's a new series about contemporary Black scholars that I think a lot of folks don't know about. So if you're interested, tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're
I got a whole list of folks that you should include in contemporary folks. I don't know if they'll make that 1776 cut though, bro.
Oh, no, no.
I don't think they will.
No, well,
you're talking about like Thomas Sowell, I'm just like, that's not quite, that's not, the direction I would be thinking about.
Well, no. Well, then viewpoint diversity. That's what we want. I want every single.
Okay, so who are you positioning as this is curriculum? We're talking about like, and I believe in putting two pieces of thought together, to side by side. I think was one of the best, one of my favorite things to use when I was teaching. Who are you using as a contemporary Black economist opposite of Thomas Sowell? Not just, we're including him. Who's the opposite framework? Experience. I'm just curious. I don't know. I've not read the
Sharif, the reason I'm raising this is because I'm making an invitation to who else, because we're just starting with the first unit that's coming out tonight is actually on Dr. Walter Williams. I don't know if you know his work. Amazing work. And then we're going to do Sowell, but then we're open. Then, because this is wait,
Ian. Wait. I'm just, and Debbie, I know you want to move on, but I'm just curious. You said that you want to bring up diversity of thought. Yeah. But it sounds like you're, if I was writing a curriculum, I was like, hey, the thing I really want you to do is be able to analyze critically. Then I would have a side by side right from the beginning, not, here's who I'm going to put out there first. And then, come tell me who's up. I would say like, hey, here's two ways that people have thought. And I would look at the background. Hey, this person actually grew up in this neighborhood, and this person, maybe they were an immigrant, and their concept and their construct was different than the Black experience, right? Like, so for me, if I'm really pushing, critical analysis, that's what I want to do. I would start off with side-by-sides. Right. And that's what I would challenge you to do, and whoever else is right. And again, I'll take a look at it. I've not looked at it. I've seen bits and pieces of it. But when I hear like, oh, we want diverse thought, and here's who we're putting in front, I'm just like, he ain't that diverse. He's just a little darker, you know what I mean, than some of the other folks who think that way. So I would just challenge you to really look at what are some other frameworks, and particularly, even share like, hey, because we know that there's the Black experience is not a monolith, and we know, and me, I'm sure you and many other folks in this chat have spoken or traveled to a lot of different places, right? And we understand that there are different nuances that influence how you've come up, how you were raised, how you're thinking, what your interactions are. Right. And so all of that. And so I would say, as someone who's writing curriculum, that's something to think about and to put up front from the very start.
I'm with you, man. I'm with you. I look forward to bringing you in and getting some of the scholars. The side-by-side, that's interesting. That is something we were going to do after we established, because sometimes doing side-by-sides doesn't actually always give you the right opportunity, but this is good input.
You're right. Side-by-side doesn't give you the right opportunity to do certain things. It's all about intended impact, right? But I hear you.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, they're so spicy. I love it. I love it. I love it.
But Debbie, the reason this is good, it shows that we have an opportunity to chart a different path for how we educate our own kids, right? And we have the power to expose our kids to Sowell or whomever, scholars that a lot of our kids have no idea their ideas even exist. And so I just, like, we always have to provide, what is it that we want our kids to say yes to? Not always, what is it that someone else is holding them back from? We have the power to chart our own path. Anyway, I'm excited to have this conversation for Sharif going forward.
Wonderful. Gentlemen, we are at about 15 minutes before we are going to be at time. We did a much better job this time at getting to questions from panelists because we got 0 in the last time. So we've done some, but I'd like to get some more. So I'm going to ask if we can try to maybe get a little bit tighter in our answers so I can get in more questions before we have to wrap. Okay. It's a goal, but it's a spicy back and forth, so we'll see how it goes. Here's our next question. What are the most credible sources to use when researching and possibly teaching critical race theory? I am sure there is false information out there, which is why some believe it teaches divisiveness.
I mean, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, when you're talking about, education, I mean, 2 areas I would probably start with is Gloria Ladson-Billing and Kimberly Crenshaw, and look at how they describe it, how it can be used as a pedagogical framework, and what it means in an educational ecosystem. I think those would be, starting points to really see how does it, again, it's something that materialized elsewhere, but, these are, 2 giants that can give, some pretty, important insight as far as how it relates to the educational ecosystem. Gloria Ladson-Billing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, those are the intellectual architects. Also Delgado, Stefanczyk. Those you have to read those if you really want to do a deep dive into critical race theory. And there are other theories by other. Whether it's Sowell and others, discrimination and disparities, man, these are powerful books to read, and read them all, and come to your own conclusions about the path forward.
Thank you, guys. Next up, what would some positive and useful critical race theory practices look like in your respective views?
I'll leave that one to Sharif.
Deb, can you repeat that?
Absolutely. What would some positive and useful critical race theory practices look like in your view?
I mean, I think one, just making sure that we are, and again, how I framed it earlier, whatever you're teaching, who does it center? I think I gave this story before. 8 Black Hands, we were, we were doing a live show, and it was being hosted by a museum. And, we saw elementary school students coming into this museum. There was a, diverse group of students. And we were a little, just not little, we were very dismayed because we knew what they were going to see. We had a chance to see the exhibits in this museum. It was a STEM museum. Every exhibit featured a white man, every single one. And we couldn't help but to think like how that experience is like a 13-year experience, not just in school, but also in society and other classrooms, right? And if we say the world is our classroom, and this is a class trip. So not only in their school, did they probably see something very similar in the literature, in all their courseworks, then they go to another classroom, which is this museum, and see the same thing. And after years and years of that, what does that say to the young lady about her place and her and women contributors and so forth? What does it say to the Black and brown children, right? Because it's not just in that space. If there's not an educator who can challenge that and get them to think from other angles and say like, hey, what's missing? Or here's some other way. There are many folks who just double down just how they're teaching it. So I would say, one, just how do you create windows and mirrors? How do you analyze and help students analyze? And then secondly, whose voices, perspective, and experiences are missing? No matter what you teach, you can add some context and color and voice inclusivity to it.
Thank you for that. I've got another one here. We've seen some think tanks and education columnists suggest that moral panic over critical race theory is an opportunity for charter school advocates to gain ground legislatively and politically. What are your views on the influence this conversation is having on the conversation around charter schools and school choice?
Well, I do think, I mean, it's a little bit intermingled with the reality of COVID, and just in general, parents have had much more visibility into what's going on in their schools. And frankly, I don't think a lot of them like what they see, even independent of critical race theory. That's why I think you see such wide increases, particularly in the Black community, saying homeschooling is a much greater. So in a sense, this is this kind of Overton window of this is probably the greatest opportunity in some ways for parental choice in education, just because, again, bottom line is the majority of our kids in our country are not reading at grade level. Parents want better schools, period. So CRT is just another thing thrown in my view, to a general dissatisfaction with your local school. And to me, if there's anything good that comes out of this, there is more school choice, there is more history and real content, especially in elementary school for kids of all races, so we improve reading levels, which is the foundation of equality.
Thank you, Ian. So we've got another question here. How do we reframe the upper and lowercase versions of CRT to ensure that accurate history and logic and critical thinking are at the center of education practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a full court press in both teacher prep and curriculum writing and instructional coaching. I think it's from all angles. I know the work that we're doing with future Black educators, developing them, and we use the Freedom School model. So we are centering the students and their experiences and their the aspirations that they have, right? And so when we have high school and college students learning how to teach and using literacy as the framework, literacy, positive racial identity, and problem solving is the foundation of the Freedom School movement. And so being able to do that, and I'm glad you mentioned Reconstruction and what Queen Kai and them are doing, right? Like that's, I think that's a cousin of what we're, if not a sister to what we're doing. And I think starting much earlier and just like, how do we imagine what students learn? I think that's a part of it. Like, when we talk about when I talk to so many teachers and they're like, hey, we were trained on Piaget, Dewey, Horace Mann, and all these like frameworks that not only didn't center Black and brown excellence and experience, they didn't even center them being, majority of the students in public school in many spaces. And so what does it mean for B.F. Skinner to be your framework to learn how to teach, as opposed to, what was Dr. Carter G. Woodson and Mary McLeod Bethune and Lucy Craft Laney? How did they think about educating students? And, they most certainly thought literacy was absolutely crucial, but how did they go about it, right? And how do you center the Black child's experience in this system, and not just, again, because I don't believe that things are just neutral. So you're just like, just teach literacy. Like, when I learned one of the ways I learned how to read at Head Start, it was from a Black pedagogical framework. And the teachers who were teaching it, they taught me that even the alphabet differently. We didn't sing A, B, C, D. We taught Abaca, da, Efa, Ga, Haija, Kalumina, Pa, Quara, Sata, Ava, what, Za, Ya, Za. They were doing it from a phonics space, and they said, this is how we're going to teach you how to read. But they had a different vision right from the start and how they were writing it.
Thank you for that. We are at 5 minutes, so if we really hurry, maybe we can get 2 more questions in. Maybe more if you're really fast. How should teachers talk about power and privilege without demoralizing students of color?
Ooh, that's a deep question. First of all, they shouldn't reduce everyone solely to their race. I mean, this is, it's like that Evanston, Illinois case I talked about. They were teaching white kids about their, quote, internalized dominance, end quote. I don't want some white kid believing they've got some internalized dominance, because what are you now telling a Black kid, right? I mean, it's just this whole idea where we reduce everything to race. I think is when we get into real territory, and the concept, or dangerous territory. When we talk about privilege, there's a lot of factors that affect privilege. Race is definitely one of them, but there's a lot of white kids in this country that are suffering, and we never really talk about it. There are a lot of Black kids that are doing well, right? Because there's issues of class or a whole bunch of other things. So I think the more that we stay away from this idea of race reductionism, where you're solely one thing, you have sole power or privilege simply based on skin color, it's just, we just live in a more complex world right now. And yeah, so I would avoid the race reductionism.
I mean, I certainly agree that we live in a complex world, but I would say that most educators approach it as if it's anything but. And so the default for them was, we're looking at a place like Pennsylvania and 94% of the teachers are white. The default is going to be and they likely went to a district that was all white. And they are, I think, going to approach it as if it is not complex, and that there are not other ways to think about it, that there are not other ways to, historical lenses and paradigms. And so I think, one way, if you ask a typical teacher, how do you support the positive racial identity development? Not only could they not even tell you what that is, they will tell you that that was never even brought up in my teacher prep program. And so to even think about what that means while teaching literacy, while teaching other things, I think is an important thing to wrestle with. And I think the other aspect of it is, don't just teach, the angle where, Black people were victims. Also show that, this country, if it's going to reach its, whatever ideal state where everybody's equal, it's going to be a whole lot of lessons learned from Black, brown, and indigenous people and their movements and their contributions and their cultural frameworks, because that's who have always challenged what was placed in those founding documents. And so the allies that support that, both in the educational ecosystem as well as adjacent to it, it is be important to note and be able to show, here's their humanity, here's their dignity, here's their creativity, here's how all of that continued despite what the law was, despite what the policy was. Here's with all the shackles from tying one hand to the opposite foot, here's how Tulsa was built. Here's what they did in Philadelphia and New York. here's what contributors in the Midwest or Southwest, here are all the ways that they did it, and uncover it, because so much of it is buried. I was reading an article, and sorry, it's a little long-winded, but it was just talking about the industrial age and how many patents were given to Black people. But it was not just done in a vacuum. It was also thinking about, okay, most of them were in the North, and having students analyze, why would most of the patents, is it just like more inventive Black people were in the North? Or were there other forces that, that forced or did not allow inventions and patents to be awarded in some places? And being able to analyze that is part of the critical analysis. It doesn't mean that, but it also shares like, yeah, there were other people who were inventing stuff. It just wasn't, whoever, Edison, right? Like there are a whole lot of other folks who were inventing a whole lot of things and what happened. So even things like that can help us wrap our minds around other ways to share information and history, as well as teach critical analysis and literacy.
Thank you so much. And Mr. El-Mekki, you will have to have the last word because we are at time. I want to thank you for coming back again today, and thank you as well, Ian and Rob. This was a wonderful discussion. We are a diverse sector. We represent many different perspectives and viewpoints and experiences. We come together with a shared passion for high quality education and creating opportunities for every child to have a high quality public education in this country. I thank you for being willing to engage in a really thoughtful discussion where you didn't agree on everything, and sometimes it got a little spicy. I like the spiciness. Let's keep it going. I'm sorry that I cannot take you all out for drinks in the hotel lobby because we're not in a public place, but soon we will have drinks and others will join us and we'll keep the conversation going. Thanks everybody for joining us today. And I am so sorry that we couldn't get to everyone's questions. Take care.
Thank you.